Grant had been staring at the same four walls for 6 weeks by the time Kevin called. The winter had dragged on the way Alaskan winters do when you are stuck inside with nowhere to be and nothing useful breaking up the days. The snow had come early that year, and it had come hard, and it had not let up since, and by mid-January the novelty of a good snowfall had worn itself down to nothing. Grant had done everything there was to do inside a house. He had cleaned things that did not need cleaning. He had watched everything worth watching twice. He had organized his gear room 3 separate times, not because it needed it, but because it gave his hands something to do. His wife had pointed out on more than one occasion that he was getting restless in a way that made him difficult to be around, and she was not wrong about that. Alaskans are built for the outdoors, and when you take the outdoors away from them for long enough, something starts to go sideways. Kevin had it just as bad. He lived 20 minutes down the road, and he called twice that week already just to talk about nothing. Because talking was better than sitting in silence, listening to the wind work on the roof. So Wade called that Thursday morning and said he was thinking about heading out to the ridge and asked if Grant wanted to go. It took about 4 seconds to say yes. Grant was already thinking about which rifle to bring before the call was over. They had been hunting together their whole lives. Their father had started taking them out when Grant was 9 and Kevin was 6, and neither one of them had been old enough to carry a full-size rifle, but they had gone anyway because their father believed in starting early and in teaching boys how to move through the backcountry without getting themselves killed. He had taught them how to read snow and how to read weather and how to watch an animal without the animal knowing it was being watched. He had taught them which trees to use for shelter and how to build a fire when everything around you was wet, and how to navigate back to a trailhead when the light was going and the landmarks were getting hard to read. By the time they were teenagers, they knew that country better than most men twice their age. By the time they were adults, it was second nature. The ridge they were heading to was a place they had hunted for over 20 years. They knew where the ptarmigan ran in winter and where the grouse liked to sit heavy in the spruce trees on cold mornings. They knew the trail in and the trail out, and every landmark between the trailhead and the deep country where the good hunting was. There was nothing about that place that should have surprised them. Grant loaded the truck while Kevin was still on his way over. He threw in both their rifles and the ammunition, and the cold weather gear and the wall tent they always brought when they were planning a full day, because in Alaska in January the light dies early and conditions can change fast, and 2 men who know what they are doing do not go into the backcountry without a plan for staying the night if they have to. The wood stove went in. The fuel canisters for the camp lamps went in. The food bag went in. Grant had done this so many times that his hands moved through the packing without him having to think about it. Kevin pulled up while Grant was loading the last of it and climbed out of his truck, already dressed for the cold with his rifle case under his arm and a thermos of coffee in his other hand. He handed the thermos to Grant without being asked because he knew Grant would not have made any. They drove out on the main road as the sun was still trying to clear the tree line to the east. The sky was pale and flat, and the kind of gray that sits over Alaska in deep winter like a lid on a pot. The temperature was sitting right around 0, and the truck heater was working hard, and neither of them talked much for the first stretch of road. Kevin drove because he always drove when they went out together, something that had started years ago without either of them deciding it and had just stayed that way. Grant rode and drank the coffee and watched the country go by out the passenger window. The houses thinned out after the first few miles, and then there were no houses at all, just a road and the trees on both sides and the occasional power line running alongside before it eventually dead-ended and turned back toward town. The pavement turned to packed gravel about 15 minutes out, and the truck handled the change without complaint. The further they got from town, the quieter things felt even inside the cab. Kevin turned the radio off somewhere around the 20-minute mark, not because anything was bothering him, but because it felt right to ride quiet out here. The cell signal dropped a few minutes after that, and Grant noticed it the way you notice it when you're used to it. One bar, then none, and then just a little X that meant you were on your own out here and the rest of the world was not coming to find you. That was part why they came. The trail off the main road was narrow, and the trees crowded it from both sides with branches heavy with snow hanging low enough to brush the top of the cab as they pushed through. The light out here was different than it was on the road. Thinner, more reluctant. It filtered down through the spruce canopy in broken pieces and landed on the snow in pale patches that barely moved. There was no wind down in the trees, just a stillness that sat over everything like the forest was holding its breath. Grant had always liked this part of the drive, the moment when the last of the road noise fell away and the world outside the windows became something that belonged entirely to itself. Kevin slowed the truck as the trail got rougher and the ruts in the frozen ground got deeper and the trees pressed in closer. They went slow and careful the last quarter mile, the way you have to out here in winter, when the ground can do unexpected things under the snow. The trailhead was a small flat clearing, just wide enough to turn the truck around in. Kevin pulled in and cut the engine, and for a moment they just sat there in the quiet with the tick of the cooling engine and the sound of nothing else at all. Grant climbed out first, and the cold came at him full and clean and honest. He pulled in a long breath and let it out slow and watched the steam of it rise and disappear. Kevin came around front of the truck, already pulling on his pack. They moved through the gear, checked the way they always did. Rifles loaded and safed. Packs on, licenses in the inside pocket where they would not freeze. Kevin checked his boots and Grant checked his compass out of habit, even though he had not needed a compass on this trail in 15 years. Kevin looked up at the tree line ahead, and then at Grant, and something passed between them the way it does between people who've been doing the same thing together for a long time. Not a word, just a look. Grant nodded once, and they started up the trail, and the trees closed in behind them, and the trailhead and the truck disappeared like they had never been there at all. The trail was familiar under their boots, but winter had a way of making familiar things feel slightly different, and they both moved with the kind of attention that comes from knowing a place well enough to notice when something is off. The snow was deep on either side of the packed trail, and the spruce trees on both sides were loaded heavy with it, and occasionally a branch would give and dump a small avalanche of powder onto the trail ahead with a soft thump that was the only sound in the whole forest. Grant settled into the rhythm of the walk the way he always did out here. His pack was heavy enough to remind him it was there, but not heavy enough to slow him down. Kevin was a few steps behind him, and Grant could hear his breathing and the creak of his pack straps and nothing else. The cold was steady and dry, and the kind that gets into your lungs in a way that feels good when you are moving. After about 20 minutes on the trail, Grant felt the last of the 6 weeks of walls and windows and restless indoor hours fall away from him completely. Out here, the only thing that existed was the next step and the cold and the trees and the country ahead of them that they knew and trusted and had been coming back to their whole lives. Whatever was waiting for them out on that ridge, they had no reason to think it was anything other than a good day of hunting in the kind of country that had always been theirs. The trail climbed gradually as it moved north, and the trees shifted from mixed birch and spruce to almost entirely spruce the higher they got. The birch had already dropped everything by this point in the year, and stood in pale thin clusters with their bare branches reaching up into gray sky, like something trying to get out. The spruce stayed dark and full and heavy year-round out here, and in winter they were the dominant thing in the landscape, dense and close together and dark enough that the spaces between them swallowed light instead of letting it through. Grant had always thought there was something cathedral about spruce forests in winter. The silence had a depth to it that you did not get anywhere else. Kevin had called it churchyard quiet once years ago, and Grant had not forgotten that, because it was exactly right. The kind of quiet that made you feel like you should lower your voice even when there was no one around to hear you. They moved through it without talking. Words felt wrong out here on a morning like this. The trail leveled off after about 40 minutes and opened into a wider corridor between two ridge lines where the wind came through in the summer but had gone quiet now with everything frozen in place. This was where they usually started seeing sign. Tracks in the snow. Feathers. The small packed depressions where ptarmigan had been sitting overnight in groups for warmth. Grant slowed his pace and Kevin came up alongside him, and they both scanned the snow ahead without saying anything. There was fresh sign within the first 100 yards past the corridor. Small three-toed prints moving in a loose group through the powder off to the left of the trail. Ptarmigan for certain. A good size group from the look of it. Kevin pointed without speaking and Grant nodded, and they stepped off the trail together and moved into the trees toward where the tracks were headed. The morning was still early and the light was still thin, and the whole ridge ahead of them was quiet and cold and completely theirs. Neither one of them had any reason to think that was about to change. They had pushed deep into the backcountry by the time the morning light fully settled over the ridge, and the hunting was as good as either of them had seen in a few years out here. The ptarmigan were moving in loose groups through the spruce and birch at the lower edge of the tree line, and Grant dropped the first one clean at about 30 yards with Kevin already swinging on a second that had flushed hard to the left. They worked the area methodically the way their father had taught them, moving slow and reading the snow for sign before each step and not pushing too fast through cover. The spruce grouse were holding tight in the lower branches the way they do on cold, still mornings, and they took 3 of those in the first hour, barely having to move for them. By mid-morning, they had covered maybe 2 miles of ground and were sitting on a solid mixed bag of birds between them, and the cold was behaving itself, and the sky had stayed flat and gray without threatening anything worse. Kevin was in a good mood the way he always got when the hunting was producing, and he was talking more than he had on the drive out, pointing out sign, and making calls on where the next group would be holding, and being right about it more often than not. Grant had always thought Kevin had a better eye for reading bird country than he did. Kevin had a patience to his scanning that Grant had never quite managed to develop the same way. Grant was a better shot, but Kevin was the better hunter, and they both knew it, and neither of them had a problem with it. They moved north along the ridge through the late morning, and the trees thinned some as the elevation changed, and the snow out in the open stretches was unbroken and deep and bright even under the flat sky. They were well off any marked trail by this point and well away from any road. The nearest road was the one they had driven on, and it was the better part of 3 miles behind them through dense country. Out here there was nothing. No snowmobile tracks. No boot prints from other hunters. Just the ridge and the trees and the snow and the birds moving through it. That was when Grant saw the man. He was standing in a small open flat between 2 spruce clusters about 60 yards ahead and slightly uphill. Grant stopped walking, and Kevin nearly walked into him from behind and started to say something before he saw what Grant was looking at and went quiet. The man was just standing there, not moving, not looking around, just standing in the open like he was waiting for a bus on a street corner somewhere, and not in the middle of the Alaskan backcountry at 0 degrees in January. He had no pack, no rifle, no snowshoes. He was wearing what looked like a regular work jacket, the kind of thing you might wear to walk to your mailbox. No insulated pants, no proper boots from what Grant could see, no balaclava, no hat that would do anything useful in this cold. Grant and Kevin stood there for a moment just looking at him before Grant called out. The man turned toward them when Grant called, and that was the first thing that felt wrong. Not the way he turned, but the fact that he did not seem startled. He had to have heard them moving through the brush for the last several minutes at least, and yet when Grant called out, he turned with the kind of calm that did not match the situation at all. They moved toward him through the snow, and Grant was already running through the possibilities. Lost hiker, somebody who had gotten separated from a group, somebody who had come out underprepared and was further into hypothermia than he looked. But when they got close enough to see his face, none of those explanations held. His skin was not the pale, waxy color of a man losing heat. His eyes were clear and focused. He was not shaking. He was not moving with the slow, deliberate effort of someone fighting the cold from the inside. He looked at Grant and Kevin the way you look at people you were expecting to see, and he did not say anything until Grant asked him if he was all right. He said he was fine. Grant asked him where he had come from, and he did not answer that. Kevin asked if he had a group somewhere nearby, and he did not answer that either. He just looked at them with that same steady, unhurried expression, and then he asked how far it was to the nearest road. Grant and Kevin exchanged a look. Grant turned and pointed back in the direction they had come from, and started to explain that the road was about 3 miles back through the trees, and that they had a truck at the trailhead, and could take him out when they were done for the day. He turned back to tell the man this. The man was gone, not stepping away, not disappearing into the trees, just gone the way a light goes out. One moment he was there, and the next moment there was nothing in that flat between the two spruce clusters but snow and cold air and the two of them standing in it. Kevin said something low under his breath that Grant did not quite catch. They both stood there for a long moment, looking at the place where the man had been, and then looking at the trees around them, and then looking at each other. There were no tracks leading away from where he had been standing. The snow around his position was smooth and undisturbed past the immediate area where his boots had compressed it. Nowhere to go, no direction he could have moved in that fast without leaving a trail in snow that deep. Grant did not have an explanation for it, and Kevin did not offer one. And after another long moment, they both made the same unspoken decision to keep moving, because standing there staring at empty snow was not going to produce an answer either of them could use. They hunted the rest of the afternoon with less conversation than they'd had all morning, not because they were scared exactly, but because the easy comfort of the day had shifted into something harder to name. They shot well enough, picked up a few more ptarmigan in the early afternoon, and pushed into some new country on the back side of the ridge that Kevin had wanted to check for a while. The birds were there, and they took what they came for, and the hunting was good on paper. But Grant kept finding himself scanning the trees between shots in a way he was not used to doing out here, looking for something standing still in a place where nothing should be standing still. Kevin was doing it too. Grant could see it in the way his brother moved, a little more deliberate, a little more aware of what was behind him than usual. The light started going in the mid-afternoon, the way it does in Alaska in January, when the sun never gets fully overhead and just tracks low across the southern sky before giving up entirely. By 3:30 the shadows were long, and for the light was gray and thin and heading somewhere else fast. They turned back toward the truck without discussing it because they both felt the day closing down and knew the way back well enough to move through it on muscle memory. The ridge behind them went quiet as they walked, and the cold deepened the way it does when the light leaves and the temperature drops its last few degrees into the kind of dark cold that means business. Grant set a good pace back toward the trailhead, and Kevin stayed with him, and neither of them looked back at the ridge they were leaving behind them, even though Grant thought about it more than once on the way out. The trailhead came into view through the last stretch of trees right around the time the sky went from gray to the deep blue that comes just before full dark in winter, and Grant felt the familiar relief of seeing the truck sitting there exactly where they had left it. Kevin reached it first and set his rifle against the tailgate and dropped his pack and blew out a long breath that steamed heavy in the cold air. Grant came up alongside him, and they stood there for a moment the way you do at the end of a hard day in the field before the business of loading up and heading home takes over. The birds went in the cooler in the truck bed, and the packs went in behind them, and Grant opened the passenger door and tossed his rifle in and waited for Kevin to get in on the driver side the way he always did. Kevin had his hand on the door handle. He tried the key. The truck did not start. He tried it again. Nothing. Not a slow crank. Not a click of a dead battery. Just nothing at all, like the truck had simply decided it was done. Kevin sat there with his hand still on the key and looked at the dash and then at Grant and said nothing for a moment. Outside the windows, the last of the light was bleeding out of the sky, and the trees around the trailhead were going dark fast, and the temperature was still dropping, and neither of them needed to say out loud what it meant that the truck was not starting, because they both already knew. Grant got out and went around the hood and popped it and stood there looking at the engine in the dying light. Everything looked the way it was supposed to look from where he was standing, but the light was already bad enough that he could not get a proper look at anything. Kevin came around and stood beside him, and they both leaned over the engine bay with their headlamps and ran through the obvious things. Battery terminals looked clean and tight. Cables looked intact from what they could see. Nothing visibly wrong from a surface inspection, but the light was going fast, and neither of them could get deep enough into the engine bay with just headlamps to diagnose anything that was not immediately obvious. Kevin tried the key 2 more times from outside, while Grant watched the engine, and nothing moved and nothing engaged, and the truck stayed dead. They had about 20 minutes of usable gray light left at most, and they both knew it. Grant straightened up and looked at Kevin over the top of the open hood, and Kevin looked back at him, and the conversation happened without words the way it only can between 2 people who've been reading each other for 40 years. They were not getting out tonight. The truck was not going to be fixed in the dark in 0-degree cold without being able to see what they were working with, and calling for help was not an option without cell service. And walking out 3 miles of backcountry trail in the dark at these temperatures was a worse idea than staying put. They had gear. They had the tent and the stove and enough food and fuel to be perfectly comfortable overnight and deal with the truck in the morning light when they could actually see what they were doing. Grant closed the hood. Kevin pulled the tent bag out of the truck bed without being asked. They had camped in worse situations than this, and they both knew it, and that knowledge settled over the evening like a familiar coat as they started clearing a flat spot in the snow beside the truck and got to work setting up camp the way 2 men do when they have done enough times that it requires no discussion at all. Kevin tried the key again the moment they got back to the truck and got nothing for it the same way he had gotten nothing the first 3 times, and Grant was already moving around the hood before the second attempt was finished. The light was bad but not gone yet, and they had maybe 30 minutes of usable gray left if they were lucky, and both of them knew that 30 minutes was not a lot of time to find a problem in an engine bay in 0-degree cold with headlamps, as your only backup once the sky finished doing what it was doing. Grant leaned in over the engine, and Kevin came around to stand beside him, and they ran through it the way 2 men do when they know what they are looking at. Battery terminals first. Both tight, and showing no corrosion worth mentioning. Kevin grabbed the positive cable and gave it a firm pull, and it held. Grant checked the negative and got the same result. They worked their way through the visible connections from their checking every plug and wire they could reach without pulling things apart, and nothing presented itself as an obvious problem. Kevin went back and tried the key again while Grant watched the engine and listened for anything that might tell him something. Nothing. Not even the suggestion of a crank. The starter was not getting a signal, or the starter was dead, or something between the battery, and the ignition was not talking to something else, and without being able to get under the truck or pull the dash, they were not going to find it tonight. Grant checked the fuse box under the hood with his headlamp, while Kevin held a second light steady over his shoulder, and they pulled the fuses one at a time and checked them against a small printed diagram on the inside of the fuse box cover. Everything checked out. Nothing blown. Nothing obviously wrong from any angle. They could work from the time and light they had left. Kevin got under the front of the truck on his back in the snow with his headlamp pointed up at the undercarriage and spent 10 minutes checking what he could reach from that position, while Grant handed him tools from a bag behind the seat. Kevin came back out from under the truck with snow packed into every crease of his jacket and nothing to show for it. The light was almost gone by then. The gray had gone blue, and the blue was going dark, and the temperature had dropped another 5 degrees in the last hour, the way it does in Alaska when the sun gives up and the cold remembers it has work to do. Grant stood at the front of the truck and looked at Kevin, and Kevin looked back at him, and they both already knew what the conversation was going to be. Kevin said they were not fixing it tonight. Grant said he knew that. Kevin said they had everything they needed to be fine until morning. Grant said he knew that too. It was a kind of exchange that sounds simple from the outside, but carried a lot of weight in the shorthand of two men who had been in the field together for decades. Neither of them was panicking. Neither of them was pretending the situation was something other than what it was. They had the walled tent and the wood stove and enough fuel for the lamps and enough food in the bag to eat well twice over, and the truck itself was good shelter if they needed it. Staying the night was not a disaster. It was just a plan now. They moved with purpose once the decision was made. Kevin pulled the tent bag out of the truck bed, and Grant pulled the stove bag, and they picked a flat spot close to the truck where the trees gave a little windbreak and got to work. The tent went up fast. They had set up enough times that the poles and the stakes and the canvas all went where they were supposed to go without either of them having to think about the sequence. Grant ran the stovepipe through the designated port in the tent roof, while Kevin got the wood stove positioned inside on its folding legs and packed with a drywall they kept split and bundled in a canvas wrap in the truck bed specifically for situations like this. The stove caught on the second match and started pushing heat into the small space immediately, the way a good wood stove does when the wood is dry and the draft is set right. Grant hung two of the camp lanterns from the tent ridgeline, while Kevin got the second pair positioned near the door, and they threw a warm yellow light to the whole interior that made the inside of the tent feel like a completely different world from the black cold outside. They pulled their sleeping bags out and laid them over the cots and got the food bags sorted, and Kevin heated a can of stew on top of the stove, while Grant got the rest of the camp organized away. He liked it, with everything in its place, and the rifles within reach and the extra ammunition in the side pocket of his pack, where he could find it in the dark if he needed to. They ate the stew, and it was good and hot, and Kevin made coffee after. And the stove had the tent warm enough that they had both unzipped the top of their jackets, and the situation felt entirely manageable in the way that most outdoor problems feel manageable once you are warm and fed and had a plan for the morning. Kevin was talking about the truck, going through the possibilities again out loud the way he did when he was working a problem. He thought it might be a relay. Grant thought it might be a connection somewhere they had not been able to reach in the dark, and said they would find it fast once they had full daylight and could actually see what they were dealing with. Kevin agreed with that and said worst case they had enough charge in both their personal locator beacons to get a signal out in the morning if the truck was something they genuinely could not fix themselves, though neither of them thought it would come to that. The stove popped and settled and the lanterns threw their steady light, and the coffee was hot, and the tent held the warmth the way a good canvas wall tent does, and for a stretch of maybe an hour it felt like just another night out in the field. Something they had done 100 times. Nothing to get worked up about. Kevin was in the middle of a sentence about whether the relay was even accessible without pulling the dash when the sound came from outside the tent. It was not loud. It was not an explosion of noise that jolted them out of their seats. It was something low and close, and without any reference point in either of their memories for what kind of thing made a sound like that. Kevin stopped talking mid-word. Grant put his coffee cup down on the cot beside him without taking his eyes off the tent wall. They both sat completely still and listened, and the sound came again from somewhere just outside the canvas, and neither of them said a word. Grant reached slowly for his rifle, and Kevin did the same, and the tent was completely silent, except for the low tick of the wood stove, and the two of them breathing careful and shallow, and waiting to hear a third time, and wondering what on earth was standing just outside that thin wall of canvas in the dark. The sound was not wind. Grant had been in enough Alaskan wilderness to know every sound wind makes against canvas, and through trees, and this was none of those things. It was not an animal either, not in any category of animal he had a name for. It had a low resonance to it that he felt as much as heard, and it was close enough that whatever was making it was right on the other side of the tent wall. Kevin had gone completely still beside him on his cot, with his rifle across his lap, and his eyes fixed on the same section of canvas wall that Grant was watching. The stove continued its low ticking. The lanterns continued their steady burn. The sound moved, not fast, not dramatically, just a slow drift from one side of the tent to the other that told them whatever was out there was moving around the perimeter of their camp and taking its time about it. Grant tracked it with his eyes as it moved along the near wall and around toward the back of the tent, and Kevin turned with it, keeping himself oriented toward it the way a man orients toward a threat when he cannot see it. It moved all the way around the front near the tent door and stopped there and went quiet, and the silence after it stopped was somehow worse than the sound itself had been, because at least when it was making noise, they knew where it was. Grant looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at Grant. Neither of them moved. The stove ticked. The lanterns burned. Outside the tent, the darkness sat on everything and gave nothing back, and whatever had just circled their camp was somewhere out there in it, and they had no idea what it was or what it wanted or why to stop right outside the door. Grant was not a man who scared easily. He had been in situations of backcountry over the years that had tested him, and he had always found his footing in those moments by falling back on what he knew and what he could control. He knew the tent. He knew the stove and the lanterns and the rifles and the gear. He knew Kevin, and he knew how Kevin moved and thought under pressure. What he did not know was what was on the other side of that canvas, and that was a thing sitting in the middle of his chest right now. Like a stone, he could not move around. Kevin shifted his weight on the cot, very slowly, and the cot creaked and both of them froze at the sound of it. Nothing responded from outside. The silence held. Grant let out a breath he had been keeping and pulled another one in slow and quiet. He thought about the man they had seen on the ridge that afternoon, the way he had been standing there in clothing that should not have kept him alive out here, the way he had not been scared, the way he had just gone like someone switching off a light. He did not say any of this out loud, and neither did Kevin, but he could see from the way Kevin was sitting that Kevin was thinking about it too. The stove needed feeding. Grant could see the glow through the small draft vent starting to dim, which meant the wood inside was burning down. And if he let go too long, the fire would drop, and the heat would drop with it, and the temperature inside the tent would start falling toward the temperature outside, which was a kind of cold that did not forgive you for being careless about it. He moved toward the stove as slowly and quietly as he could and opened the small feed door and pushed 2 more splits of wood in from the stack beside it and closed it again. And the stove responded immediately with a deeper tick and a stronger glow through the vents. The lanterns were still burning strong. The tent was still warm. Outside the tent, the sound had not come back, and nothing had moved against the canvas. And for a few minutes, it was possible to almost convince yourself that whatever it was had moved on, and the night was going to be quiet after all. Grant settled back onto his cot with his rifle across his lap, and the lanterns burning steady, and the stove doing its work, and the night sitting heavy and completely silent outside the canvas walls around them. Kevin was the one who unzipped the tent. He did it slow and only far enough to get one eye to the gap, and Grant was right behind with the flashlight ready, and neither of them made a sound doing it. The cold poured into the gap immediately, and Grant felt it on his face, and watched Kevin go completely still the moment he got the flap open enough to see out. Kevin did not move for a long moment. He did not say anything. He just looked. Grant put a hand on his shoulder, and Kevin stepped back from the gap without closing it, and Grant took his place and put his eye to the opening and looked out into the dark and understood immediately why Kevin had gone still. The camp lanterns they had placed just inside the tent door threw maybe 8 feet of pale light into the snow around the tent entrance before the dark swallowed it entirely, and in that dark at the edge of where the light died, something was standing that should not exist. It was large in a way that did not compute right away. Not bear large, not moose large. Something that occupied space in a way that felt wrong for the scale of what surrounded it. Grant could see parts of it that suggested things he recognized. A mass across the shoulders that read like something heavily muscled. a lower profile that suggested it was not fully upright, but not fully on four legs either. But none of the parts resolved into anything consistent. The way it held itself shifted as he watched it, like whatever it was could not decide on a single form and had settled for something between several. The thing that stopped him cold was the way the light behaved around it. The lantern light that fell across the snow stopped at the edge of the creature rather than touching it, like it absorbed what reached it instead of reflecting any of it back. It was not a shadow. It was something that made shadow look pale by comparison. Grant pulled back from the gap and looked at Kevin, and Kevin looked back at him. And neither of them had words for what they were looking at, so neither of them tried. Then the sound came again, and this time was followed by something else, coming from the tree line further back in the dark. A different sound, lower and more structured than anything the creature near the tent was making. Something that carried the rhythm of communication, but ran through a register that no human throat could produce. Grant leaned back to the gap and forced himself to look past the creature toward the tree line, and he saw them, 3 of them at first, and then a 4th further to the left partially behind a spruce trunk. Humanoid in shape the way a rough sketch of a person is humanoid. Too tall, too thin in the torso. Standing completely still except for the faint motion of whatever they were doing with their mouths or their throats or whatever part of them was making that sound. They were not looking at the tent. They were looking at each other and making those sounds back and forth in a pattern that felt deliberate and organized, and that was somehow worse than if they had been looking at the tent, because it meant they were not reacting to Grant and Kevin at all. They were doing something else entirely, and Grant and Kevin were a secondary consideration at best. Grant closed the tent flap and turned to Kevin and said they needed to get the lights outside. Kevin already had his hand on the spare lantern. They had 4 camp lanterns total and 2 smaller battery-powered trail lights that Grant kept clipped to the outside of his pack, and they moved fast getting them positioned. Kevin took the 2 lanterns and pushed them out through the tent door into the snow on either side of the entrance, while Grant got the trail lights unclipped and crawled out into the cold and drove the small stakes they attached to into the frozen ground on the sides of the tent away from the door. The cold outside was savage and immediate, and the dark beyond the small circle of their light felt like a physical thing pressing in from every direction. Grant got the last trail light staked and turned on and scrambled back into the tent and zipped the door behind him, and the 2 of them knelt there in the entrance area and looked at what they had. 4 lanterns and 2 small trail lights forming a rough perimeter around the tent exterior, throwing overlapping pools of pale yellow light across the snow in every direction. Not bright, not the kind of light that pushed back the dark very far, but light. Grant became aware as he was looking at it that the creature had moved. It had been at the edge of the dark near the front of the tent when he had looked out, and now the sound it was making was coming from the side, circling, moving around the perimeter of the light, the way something does when it is testing for a gap. Kevin heard it too and tracked it with his eyes along the tent wall. The humanoid shapes at the tree line had not moved. Their sounds continued in that steady and human back and forth that Grant could now hear clearly through the canvas, and every time he registered it, something in the back of his skull told him to stop listening to it, which was not a reaction he had ever had to a sound in his life before tonight. The creature completed a circle of the tent and came back around the front and stopped at the edge of the light perimeter, and Grant could see its mass there through the small gap he had left in the tent door zipper. It did not come into the light. It stood at the boundary where the light ended and the dark began, and its weight shifted from whatever passed for its feet, and it made a sound that Grant felt in his back teeth. Kevin had his rifle up. Grant reached out and pushed the barrel down gently because he did not think a rifle was going to be useful here. What he thought might work was the light. He picked up the spare flashlight from beside his pack and unzipped the door 3 inches and pushed the beam directly at the creature at the edge of the perimeter. The creature recoiled, fast and hard the way something does when it hits something genuinely painful. It pulled back from the light, and the sounds it made changed register for a moment into something sharper before settling back into its lower circuit. Grant kept the beam on it for another 5 seconds, and it stayed back. He pulled the flashlight inside and zipped the door and looked at Kevin. Kevin looked at the lanterns around the tent and then at Grant and said out loud first. The light was keeping it back. Grant said he thought so. Kevin looked at the fuel levels on the nearest lantern and then at the darkness outside and then back at Grant and did not say anything else because the thing neither of them wanted to say out loud yet was that they had a finite amount of fuel and the night in Alaska in January was a very long thing and the dark outside the tent was not going anywhere. Grant did the math in his head without wanting to. They had 4 lanterns and 2 trail lights. The lanterns ran on liquid fuel, and he had brought 2 spare fuel bottles the way he always did. And under normal circumstances, that was more than enough for an overnight. But normal circumstances did not include running every light they had at full burn all night to hold something back from the tent. The trail lights were battery powered and would last longer, but they were also the weakest lights in the setup, and he did not know what happened to perimeter if the lanterns started going down, and the trail lights were the only thing left. He filed that problem away for later, because later was not now, and right now what mattered was that the perimeter was holding. The creature was still circling outside it. He could track its movement by the sound it made, and by the way the sound changed as it moved from one side of the tent to the other. It never came into the light, but it never left either. Just kept its slow, patient circle around the boundary, the way something does when it's time, and it knows you do not. The humanoid shapes at the tree line were still there. Their sound had not stopped. Grant could hear them clearly now even through the canvas, and what bothered him most about the sound was not how wrong it was. It was how consistent it was. Back and forth in pattern. Call and response. Like a conversation that had been going on for a long time and had no intention of stopping. Kevin was watching the tent walls and tracking the creature by sound and holding his rifle across his knees. And Grant could see in his face that Kevin understood exactly what they were dealing with even if neither of them had a name for it. They were going to be here all night. Whatever was outside, that tent was going to be there all night with them. And the only thing standing between the two of them and whatever came next was a thin circle of light burning in the snow around them, and the fuel that was already starting to count down the moment Grant thought about it. Grant added wood to the stove without taking his eyes off the tent walls for long, and the stove responded with a deeper burn that pushed more light through its draft vents and added to the ambient glow inside the tent. Every source of light felt important right now, even the stove. Kevin had positioned himself facing the door with his back to the rear wall of the tent, and his rifle across his knees, and his eyes moving between the door gap and the side walls in a slow, steady pattern that told Grant he had settled into something deliberate. Not panic, not paralysis, just the focused attention of a man who has decided to deal with what is in front of him rather than what it means. Grant moved to the opposite side of the tent, so that between them they had eyes on every wall, and pulled his rifle into his lap and settled his breathing. The creature passed close to the right side of the tent, and the sound it made as it passed was close enough that Grant felt the urge to put his hand against the canvas and stopped himself from doing it. The lantern on that side of the perimeter was burning steady, and the creature stayed outside it, but the proximity of the sound made the distance feel smaller than the light suggested. The humanoid shapes of the tree line called back and forth to each other, and the creature answered them once with something that ran lower and longer than their sounds. An exchange lasted maybe 10 seconds before the creature went back to its circuit, and the shapes of the tree line resumed their pattern. Whatever was happening out there had a structure to it that Grant could not parse and did not want to think too hard about, because thinking about it led to questions he had no answers for, and no answers were going to help him get through the next several hours. What was going to help him get through the next several hours was the light staying on, and the fuel holding out, and Kevin staying steady beside him, and the rifles being within reach if it came to that. He focused on those things and watched the walls and listened to perimeter and kept his breathing even and watched the fuel level on the nearest lantern and told himself the same thing over and over. Just get to morning. The creature did not stop circling. Grant had been hoping that the light perimeter would send it off into the trees the way a campfire is supposed to discourage bears and wolves and the other things that live in Alaskan wilderness that you do not want close to camp at night. But this was not that. The light pushed it back in the tent, but it did not drive it away, and as the first hour of the night wore on, it became clear that whatever was out there had no intention of leaving. It just kept its slow, patient circuit around the edge of the light, moving from one side to the other, and occasionally stopping at a point on the perimeter and pressing close to where the light ended before pulling back again like it was measuring something, testing the boundary, looking for the weakest point in the ring. Kevin tracked it by sound, and Grant tracked it by sound, and between the two of them, they had its position mapped at every moment, but knowing where it was did nothing to make the sound of it easier to process. It was not a sound that belonged in any category Grant had. Not animal, not mechanical, not the kind of subsonic frequency that wind makes through dense spruce forest on a hard, cold night. It had a texture to it that the other sounds did not have, and it changed slightly as the creature moved, as if the sound itself was directional and meant for something specific rather than just being noise. The humanoid shapes at the tree line were worse in a different way. The creature was large and close and immediate, and the threat it represented was physical and present. The shapes at the tree line were further away, and they were not moving toward camp, and in a strictly practical sense, they were less dangerous than things circling the tent. But the sound they made did not stop. Not for a minute. Not for 30 seconds. A constant back and forth in that structured inhuman register that carried across the distance between the tree line and the tent with a clarity that suggested the cold air was doing them a favor by not muffling it. Grant had tried early in the night to not listen to it, and found that he could not stop. The sound had a quality that pulled at his attention the way a conversation in another room pulls at you when you are trying to sleep. You cannot make out the words, but you cannot stop your brain from trying, and the trying is what keeps you awake. Kevin had stopped watching the tree line after the first hour. Grant noticed it and thought Kevin had the right idea and tried to do the same, and found he also could not fully manage it. The stove needed feeding every 40 minutes or so, and they had worked out a rotation, without discussing it, where one of them kept watch on the tent walls while the other moved to feed the wood in. They were burning the stove hotter than they normally would because the heat translated to light through the draft vents, and every additional source of light felt worth the extra fuel cost. The wood supply from the truck bed was stacked inside the tent door, and there was enough of it to last through the night without rationing it, which was one problem they did not have. The lamp fuel was the problem. Grant had done the calculation twice in his head and arrived at the same answer both times. Running 4 lanterns at full burn through a full Alaskan January night was going to outlast their fuel supply by somewhere between 2 and 3 hours. He had not told Kevin this yet, because Kevin had clearly done the same calculation and had not said anything about it either, and Grant understood that to mean they were both operating on the same unspoken agreement, which was to deal with 1 hour at a time and not get ahead of themselves. Around what Grant estimated was midnight, the nearest lantern on the right side of the perimeter flickered. It was brief. A single dip in the flame that lasted maybe 2 seconds before the burn steadied again. But 2 seconds was enough. The creature was at the tent wall before either of them could process what had happened. The canvas on the right side of the tent pressed inward hard and fast, and the shape of the impression it made was wrong in every dimension. Not a paw, not a hand, something wider and flatter, and applied with a weight that made the tent stakes creak in the frozen ground. Grant had the flashlight in his hand, and he drove the beam at the wall at the point of contact and shoved the light against the canvas from inside, and the creature pulled back immediately, and the wall snapped back to its normal shape. The sound the creature made as it retreated was sharp and different from its circling sound in a way that Grant interpreted as pain. Kevin was already at the lantern with the spare fuel bottle topping it off, and the flame came back up full and steady, and the right side of the perimeter was solid again. They both sat there for a moment looking at the place on the tent wall where the impression had been. The canvas showed no damage, no tear, no mark at all. Just smooth canvas sitting exactly where it was supposed to sit, as if nothing had touched it. Kevin set the fuel bottle down and looked at Grant, and Grant looked back, and the conversation they did not have in that moment was the loudest thing in the tent. They had seen how fast it moved when the light dropped. 2 seconds. That was all it needed. 2 seconds of dimming light, and it covered whatever distance it had been circling at and hit the tent wall with everything it had. Grant looked at the fuel bottles lined up beside the stove. They had burned through more than he had estimated in the first part of the night from running the stove hot and topping off the lanterns, and his revised calculation was worse than the first one. The humanoid shapes of the tree line had not reacted to the creature hitting the tent wall. Their sounds continued in the same steady pattern, as if nothing had happened, which told Grant something. He did not particularly want to know about the relationship between the creature and the shapes, and what all of this was, and what it was for. He pushed that thought down and focused on the lanterns. Kevin was already checking the fuel level on the left side lanterns and making small adjustments to the burn height on 2 of them to stretch the fuel further, and Grant did the same on his side. And they worked through it the way they worked through every problem out here, methodically, one thing at a time. The creature resumed its circuit outside the perimeter, and its sounds settled back into the lower register, and the humanoid shapes kept their conversation going at the tree line. And the night pressed down on the tent from every direction, and Grant fed the stove another split of wood and watched the fuel levels and counted the hours he thought were left until dawn, and came up with a number that was too high for the fuel he had left and did not say it out loud. The second half of the night was longer than the first. Grant was not sure if that was an objective fact about time, or just what it felt like from inside the tent with the lanterns burning down, and the creature outside, and the sound from the tree line that would not stop. Probably both. The cold outside was doing what Alaskan cold does in the deep hours of a January night, which was getting more serious. He could feel it at the tent seams and around the door zipper, and in the brief blast of it that came in whenever they had to open the door to adjust an outside lantern. They had to do that twice in the second half of the night. Crawling out into the dark with a flashlight in one hand to reach a lantern that needed topping off was not something either of them would have volunteered for under normal circumstances. And under these circumstances, it was the kind of task that required everything they had to make themselves do it. Grant did the first one, and Kevin did the second, and both times the creature pulled back from the light of the open door. The shapes at the tree line went briefly quiet before resuming their sounds, and both times a man who had gone outside came back in and zipped the door behind him and sat down and did not say anything for several minutes afterward. The fuel was going. By what Grant estimated was 4 a.m, they had burned through everything but the last bottle and a half, and he had reduced 2 of the 4 lanterns to their lowest stable burn to stretch what was left. The light perimeter was weaker than it had been at the start of the night, and the creature seemed to know it. Its circuits were tighter now, closer to the edge of the light, stopping longer at the boundary before moving on. The shapes at the tree line had shifted position at some point in the last hour. Not closer, just different positions within the tree line, still visible at the edge of the dark when Grant angled the flashlight toward them, still making their sounds. Kevin had his second rifle magazine sitting on the cot beside him where he could reach it fast, and Grant had done the same, not because he thought the rifles were the answer, but because having them ready was the only other thing he could control right now besides the light. The last full lantern was sitting at the front of the perimeter, and Grant was rationing it carefully, and the 2 reduced lanterns on the sides were doing their best, and the trail lights had been burning all night, and were starting to dim in the way battery lights dim when the batteries are going, which was a different problem than the fuel problem, but pointed in the same direction. Grant looked at Kevin, and Kevin was watching the front wall of the tent where the last full lantern was throwing its light, and the creature was doing its slow circuit just beyond it, and neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that dawn needed to come soon, because what they had left was not going to last until it did on its own. Grant added wood to the stove and watched the draft vents glow brighter for a moment before settling. Kevin shifted on his cot, and the cot creaked, and outside the tent the creature stopped its circuit for a moment at the sound before resuming. It had done that several times throughout the night, reacted to sound from inside the tent. Small sounds, the cot creaking, a rifle being repositioned, the stove door being opened and closed. Every time it reacted, Grant felt the awareness of it like a cold point between his shoulder blades. It was paying attention. Whatever it was and whatever it wanted, it was not mindless, and it was not random, and it had been out there the entire night, without losing interest, and that told him something about its patience that he found more unsettling than its size or its sound. Kevin looked over at Grant at some point in that last stretch of the night, and Grant looked back, and Kevin gave him a single slow nod that meant nothing specific and everything at once. They were still here. The light was still on. They were going to get through this. Grant nodded back and turned his eyes to the tent wall and watched the shadow of the creature pass across the canvas where the lantern light hit the outside of the tent from the perimeter, and counted the seconds between each pass and kept the fuel going and waited for the dark outside to start showing him something different. The last lamp fuel bottle was less than a quarter full when Grant picked it up, and he could feel how light it was before he even looked at it. He set it back down without saying anything, because there was nothing useful to say about it. They had been rationing for the last 2 hours, reducing the lanterns to their absolute minimum stable burn, and the light perimeter outside the tent was a shadow of what it had been at the start of the night. 2 of the 4 lanterns were already out. The 2 trail lights had died somewhere around 3 in the morning when the batteries gave out completely, and now it was down to 2 lanterns running on fumes, and the flashlights, and the wood stove, and the pale glow-it-through the draft vents, and Grant was managing every remaining source of light the way a man manages the last of his water in a desert, carefully, constantly, without looking away from it for long. The creature was tighter on the perimeter now. Its circuits had gotten shorter as the night went on, and the light had gotten weaker, and it was spending more time at the boundary and less time moving between points. It knew the light was going. Grant did not know how it knew, but it knew, and the knowledge of it was in the way it moved now, slower, more deliberate, less like something circling, and more like something waiting. The humanoid shapes of the tree line had not moved and had not stopped their sounds, and Grant had reached a point somewhere in the last hour where he had stopped being able to actively register the sound they made, because his mind had processed them for so many hours that they had become background noise the way a generator becomes background noise after a while, except that every time he consciously tuned back into them, the wrongness of the sound hit him, fresh, and he would have to deliberately tune back out again. Kevin was at the stove feeding at the last of the wood splits and packing them in tight to get as much burn and as much light out of what remained as he could. Grant was watching the left side lantern, which was the weaker of the 2 remaining and had been flickering for the last 10 minutes in a way that told him it was close to the end. He had the flashlight in his hand with his thumb on the switch, ready to hit it the moment the flame dropped. The lantern flickered again, held, flickered a second time, and went out, and Grant had the flashlight beam on that side of the tent wall before the flame finished dying, but it was not fast enough. The creature hit the left side of the tent with its full weight, and the canvas blew inward a full foot, and the tent stake on that corner screamed the frozen ground, and Kevin threw himself backward off his stool, and Grant drove the flashlight beam at the wall and held it there, and the creature pulled back, and the canvas snapped back, and the stake held, and they were still inside and still intact, and Grant kept the beam pointed at the wall and did not move it for a full 30 seconds while the sound the creature made outside shifted through something sharp and loud before dropping back into its lower register. Kevin was back on his feet. He looked at Grant. Grant looked at the one remaining lantern, and then at Kevin, and Kevin picked up his own flashlight without being told, and they stood there with 2 flashlights and 1 lantern, and the stove burning as hot as it would go, and outside the tent the creature moved back to its circuit, and the shapes at the tree line kept their sounds going, and the darkness outside was complete and absolute, and had been complete and absolute for hours and showed no sign of changing. Grant did not look at his watch. He had stopped looking at his watch 2 hours ago because the watching of it made the time move slower, and slower time was not something he could afford right now. He kept the flashlight ready and watched the tent walls and fed the stove the last of what was in the wood bundle and listened to the creature move and thought about nothing past the next 5 minutes because 5 minutes was all he could manage. The remaining lantern was burning on whatever was left at the bottom of the last fuel bottle, and Grant could see the flames starting to pull lower, and he reached for the bottle and tilted it and heard almost nothing move inside it and set it back down and looked at Kevin, and Kevin shook his head once slowly, which meant he had nothing left to add to it either. They were down to the flashlights in the stove and whatever minutes were left in the lantern, and outside the creature was close, and the dark was total, and Grant was working very hard to not let himself think about what happened if the flashlight batteries went before the dark outside did. Then something changed. It was not dramatic. It was not a sudden thing. It was the kind of change that you notice only after it has already been happening for a few minutes, because it is too gradual to catch the moment it starts. The darkness outside the tent was different. Not light exactly. Not yet, but less absolute than it had been. The canvas walls that had been pure black outlines against black dark for hours were now the faintest suggestion of gray at their edges, and Grant stared at it for a long moment before he trusted what he was seeing. Kevin saw at the same time, and neither of them said anything, because saying out loud felt like it might jinx it. The gray came up slowly the way dawn comes in deep winter in Alaska, which is reluctant and incremental and takes its time about announcing itself. But it came. The creature pulled back from the perimeter before the light was strong enough to see anything clearly. Grant noticed its sound moving away first. The tight circuits got wider and then wider still, and then the sound was further back in the trees, and then further than that, and then it stopped altogether, and the absence of it after a full night of hearing it was so sudden and complete that Grant felt it physically like a pressure releasing from his chest. The humanoid shapes at the tree line went quiet one by one, not all at once. One fell silent, and then a long pause, and then another, and then the third and the fourth, and then there was nothing from the tree line either, and the only sound was the stove and their own breathing, and the very faint sound of wind moving through the spruce canopy above the camp. They waited. Grant wanted to unzip the tent the moment the creature pulled back, and Kevin put a hand on his arm without looking at him, and Grant understood, and they waited until the light outside had built enough that the snow around the tent was visible through the canvas, and the trees were shapes instead of just darkness. Kevin unzipped the door. They looked out. Nothing. Snow around the tent in every direction, undisturbed and smooth. No tracks. Not from the creature. Not from the shapes at the tree line. Nothing to show that anything had been outside that tent all night, except the two of them knowing exactly what they had heard and felt and seen. Kevin stepped out first and Grant followed, and they stood in the cold gray morning light, and neither of them spoke. They did not discuss it. They did not try to explain it or process it or assign language to it. They just moved. Grant went straight to the truck and popped the hood, and in the full light of morning with clear eyes, he saw it immediately. A battery cable on the far side of the engine block that had worked itself loose from its terminal, completely disconnected, sitting right there in plain sight. Something they had run their hands over in the dark the night before without finding it, because the angle was wrong and the light was wrong, and they had been working blind. He pushed the cable back onto the terminal and pressed it down until it seated and called to Kevin to try the key. The truck started on the first turn. Kevin got out, and they broke camp in under 4 minutes. The tent came down fast and went into the truck bed in a heap without being folded. The wood stove one behind it still hot enough that Grant could feel the heat off it through his gloves, and he did not care, and Kevin did not care, and the tent that went on top of it would have to deal with whatever that did to it. Nothing got packed properly. Nothing got rolled or stowed or secured the way they normally would have done it. Everything went in the bed, and Grant got the tailgate up, and Kevin was already in the driver's seat, and the truck was moving before the tailgate was fully latched. Kevin drove the trail out fast, faster than he normally would have on a frozen, rutted trail in the dark, but it was not fully dark anymore, and he drove it like a man who needed to be somewhere else. Grant sat in the passenger seat and watched the trees go by and did not look back down the trail behind them. They came around the long curve in the trail that brought them to the stretch where they had first seen the man the day before. Grant did not plan to look in the mirror. He just did it the way your eyes go to movement, even when you are trying to look somewhere else. He looked in the side mirror as they passed the spot. The man was standing there. Same place in the open flat between the two spruce clusters. Same posture. Same clothing that made no sense for the temperature. Looking straight, ahead the way he had been looking when they first found him. Like he had been standing there the whole time. Like no hours had passed. Like nothing had happened at all. Kevin did not slow down. Grant did not tell him to. The truck hit the main road, and the pavement came up on the tires, and the trees opened up, and the gray morning sky was wide and flat and pale above them. And Kevin drove, and Grant watched the road ahead. And neither of them said a word, and neither of them ever talked about going back. The heater came up and pushed warm air through the cab, and the world outside looked like any other gray January morning in Alaska with snow on the trees and flat light on the road, and nothing moving. Graham put his head back against the headrest and watched the road ahead, and Kevin drove steady with his eyes forward and did not look in the rear-view mirror once the whole drive home, which was something Grant noticed and understood completely. The first houses appeared, and then the edge of town, and everything exactly the way it always was, and always would be, and with no knowledge of what had happened out there the night before. Kevin pulled into Grant's driveway and left the engine running, and they sat there for a moment in the warm cab, and neither of them said a word. Grant opened the door and got out, and the cold hit him one final time, and he walked his house, and did not look back, and behind him he heard a truck pull out, and by the time he reached his front door, Kevin was already gone.